And I think that's very interesting because when one thinks of the transition away from sort of feudal agriculture to modern contemporary capitalist agriculture, gender matters a great deal. It's often unspoken, but in the work of scholars like Silvia Federici, and if you haven't read Caliban and the Witch, I commend it to you highly. What we see is a transformation not only in the relationship between men and women and land, and the way in which men start to be able to own and women become property in a very interesting way. In modern capitalist agriculture. But you also see those relationships extend to the rest of this picture. Now, what you don't see, oddly, is what's missing? Workers. You've got all their stuff, but they are invisibilized. And that's very interesting because already by this time, agriculture is an international concern, particularly for Britain. You have workers sort of concentrated in one part of, you have workers increasingly moving to the cities. The peasants who used to live on this land have been displaced. Where are they? They're in the cities. Sure, there are workers who sell their labor to be able to do this kind of work, but they're not here. Most of the wealth that came to make this possible was made possible through workers in cities, and again, Mr. Andrews Sr., a silversmith. That silver came from conquest largely in the New World. Now, it's important to sort of set all that out because all of a sudden what we have here, an English farm and yet a story about a global agricultural system, a system that was made possible by conquest and colonialism, and those anxieties mattered at the time of this painting. And the worries around what were happening in cities, for example, what workers were doing, and the worries around what the unruly natives in other parts of the world were doing, pressed on the nobility of Europe. And as well they should. I mean, barely 40 years after that picture, the Haitian Rebellion happened. The Haitian Revolution in 1791 was one of the most important moments of people rising up against the way that they were treated as property. And Haiti, of course, was tremendously important in terms of the kinds of crops that were coming to be important in Britain, the kinds of food that were coming to be important in Britain, sugar, most importantly. I mean, it's really interesting that the food of the English working class shifted, right? So the key food of the English working class in the 1700s, one of the key sources of nutrition was a drink that was local, that was sustainable, that was organic. That had a really great variety of nutrients in it. And that drink was beer. And of course, then it got replaced by a drink that required colonialism. It got a drink that required the conquest of places like this and of places like India and China, or at least the subjugation of places like India and China. And that drink was? Tea. Thank you. So, I mean, because for the milky tea that the British wanted, you needed milk and water and sugar from places like this, and tea from places like India and China. But those anxieties around people rising up and taking to the streets was something that the English working class were the English nobility were very serious about, and not just the English nobility. This is, of course, a bread riot in Richmond, in Virginia. From 1862. The idea of working people getting angry and taking to the streets demanding bread was a very serious and deep concern, and wherever settler colonies or Europeans found themselves, they were worried about food and hunger and rebellion. And the reason that my talk is called The Long Green Revolution is that there is a long history of worry and anxiety around what happens when people don't get food in cities. And there was a man who explained it quite nicely, elegantly, and that man was this man here, Thomas Malthus. Now, Thomas Malthus has a very simple way of explaining how food and hunger and population can lead to something like this. Thomas Malthus's idea is, of course, as simple as this, that at some point, food production increases arithmetically. And so there's, a certain amount of food and a certain amount of food, and you are getting better and better at farming, and all of a sudden you're able to squeeze more and more out of your land. The trouble is that populations are growing geometrically, and so people have many kids, and then those kids have many kids. And all of a sudden, those kids get hungry and they want to be fed, and so they eat. And then those kids, they start getting frisky, and then they shag, and then they have kids, and those kids, and so all of a sudden, there's this sort of cycle of eating and shagging that results in the sort of catastrophic moment, right, where you have food and population and they cross, and that moment right there is. The moment where we move from, sort of grumbling stomachs and raging genitals to clenched fists. And that's where the... you were reading something else into clenched fists that I wasn't intending. The clenched fist was much more about people getting very angry and taking to the streets, and pitchforks, imagine pitchforks. So that moment where all of a sudden basically you have these three animal urges of hunger and of food, of hunger and reproduction, and then anger. And that seems like, this seems foolish. This seems like a rubbish thing to think. And yet, the dates here are partly made up and partly not. In the 1960s, there was a real fear among US policymakers that the tipping point would happen, that there would be a moment where the world population would exceed the food supply, and they predicted in 1960 that would happen around about 1980. And this fear of it's not rich people who do this, of course. It's the working class. There is a fear about poor people, of working people, and of people in the global South doing all of this and eating our food. That is manifest in this picture. Now, you may think, well, no, Raj, you're just making this stuff up. But in fact, if you look at the archives of the Rockefeller Foundation, if you read the piece on the reading list, The Long Green Revolution, you will find that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that people were thinking in exactly this way, that particularly in the Great War of the 20th century, the war between capitalism and communism, that there was a deep conflict between a deep concern in capitalist nations that there would be, the population would increase in frontline states that might go communist. And then when the food ran out, those people would actually go communist. And in the 1940s, you had stories and you had examples to point to. You said, look at China, look at Russia. These are all places that had experienced food riots in one way or another. And all of a sudden, you had this, this sort of catastrophe. And so what could you do about it? Well, one man came to symbolize what could be done. That man is this man. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. Here he is at work. This is Norman Borlaug. He was deployed in the 1940s to Mexico, and he was. In fact, this is such an interesting picture because, he was sent to Mexico in the 1940s. He was recruited away from DuPont, where he was a star plant breeder. And he was brought down by the Rockefeller Foundation to run what was called the Mexican Agriculture Project. And he was brought there to grow the crop that you see in the background. Now, very quickly, the staple crop in Mexico, the crop that most people eat and for which Mexico is famous is... And he is growing. Thank you. Now, you may ask, and I know you are, why is he growing wheat? And the answer is that he was growing this wheat to be able to supply it to commercial farmers. He was doing it because he didn't think that peasant farmers had the chops or the access to land in order to be able to profit from the innovations that he was developing. Plus, in the big scheme of things, the Green Revolution that he was part of was never about feeding people in rural areas. It was about feeding people in cities. And it was part of a broader war on communism. The reason that he was deployed to Mexico, for example, was that the Mexican president, Lázaro Cárdenas, was termed out of office, and he'd been involved in a widespread land reform and a nationalization of the Mexican oil industry, which previously had belonged to the Standard Oil, the wellspring of the Rockefeller Foundation's good fortune. Nonetheless, here he is, he's deployed, he's sent out, and he develops a variety of wheat that does, in perfect conditions, does very well. And then he's, the Green Revolution moves to India, and in India, of course, the two main crops are